The Citizenship Project is brought to you in part by a grant from Tennessee Civil War National Heritage Area.
Self-made men come up in open defiance of all the efforts of society and circumstances to keep them down. There is genuine heroism in his struggle and glory in his triumph.
At the close of the Civil War, former slaves won freedom, but citizenship and the right to vote were still 5 years away. However, Tennessee would grant freedmen access to the ballot box 3 years before federal ratification of the 15th Amendment, opening the way for black men to vote and represent their community for the first time. Freedmen needed the right to vote to fully realize their rights as citizens, and Tennessee's radical Republicans needed the black vote to remain in power. On Christmas Eve, 1866, Governor William Brownlow gave a speech urging the passage of voting rights to Tennessee's black men. 2 months later, the freedmen got their wish, and Brownlow got more than he bargained for. Former Confederates had been banned from the electoral process during the war. Now the rebels watched helplessly as the franchise was given to former slaves. For many, it was the final straw. Rebel resentment erupted as vigilante groups such as the Ku Klux Klan and others wreaked havoc across the state. But the threat of violence was not enough to keep freedmen from the ballot box.
Brownlow arranged the black vote in 1867. By the end of the year, 40,000 black men had registered to vote. That's huge, 40,000. Part of it was just sheer population numbers. In West Tennessee, for example, there were a number of plantations that had 100, 150, 300 slaves. And so when suddenly everybody's free and can register to vote, you have twice as many, 3 times as many black voters as white. They had no idea how bright these folks were and how organized they were going to be. And so they would have meetings to help educate people on how to vote and how to make choices and sometimes who to vote for. So they really were enabled by a very strong leadership.
Sampson W. Keeble was one of the wealthiest black men in Tennessee. He was an attorney, a barber, and the proprietor of a prosperous boarding house in Nashville. He had been born a slave. The property of a Murfreesboro attorney and newspaper owner, Sampson was taught to read and write during a time when most whites lacked the ability. In 1851, 18-year-old Sampson was put to work as a roller boy for the Rutherford Telegraph. He continued working for the newspaper until the war, after which Keeble, along with thousands of other freedmen, headed to Nashville.
When he came to Nashville, he got involved in barbering, and that was his trade that we knew best, but he also taught school for a while. He worked as a custodian in the law firm, but that he asked questions and was interested in what they were doing, and they allowed him to read law with them and then helped him pass the bar. So he came out of a janitorial position as a lawyer. And he was on the board of a number of things, the Freedmen's Bank and an insurance company and all sorts of other things, a real leader in Nashville.
Keeble likely was caught between the black and the white world in that day and time because he knows that he has to do something for his people who are just out of slavery. And remember that African Americans are suffering badly during these particular years. There's a lot of homeless, there are paupers, orphans and so on. No person who considered himself to be a Negro could get into power without trying to do something to relieve the situation of his people.
In 1867, Keeble and other leaders of the freedmen's community first came to the aid of their people in response to a rumor that could have proven catastrophic. Word was spreading throughout Nashville that former slaves were planning to form a mob and massacre white citizens. This was during a time when African Americans were being murdered at will and without consequence throughout the South. Left unaddressed, it could have resulted in a massacre similar to the Memphis riot of May 1866, which left 48 dead and hundreds injured. Keeble helped draft a letter to city officials explaining that there was no truth to the rumor. Mounting tensions dissipated after the letter was printed in local papers. But Keeble and his peers weren't interested in simply keeping freedmen from harm. They wanted to advance their rights as American citizens.
Keeble was very much involved in the Second Colored Men's Convention. That convention was concerned with voting and being participatory in the political process.
As one of the leaders of Nashville's Black community, Sampson Keeble was riding the crest of the freedmen's electoral wave. And although he would lose his first nomination to the General Assembly in 1870, he emerged victorious 2 years later to take his seat as the first African-American Tennessean in the state legislature. Ironically, this former slave entered a capital firmly controlled by the very men who fought to keep his race in bondage. Regaining their voting rights in 1869, former Confederates easily took the reins from Republicans. Keeble's welcome to the State House was not a warm one.
In the House, all solitary and alone, sits the Honorable S.W. Keeble of Nashville. The colored element of Davidson would not permit itself to be overlooked. It furnished a large proportion of the voters and demanded representation. He is evidently very lonesome and looks as if he thought he was doing something wrong. But enough for the present of Mr. Keeble. As the pioneer colored legislator of this state, he is entitled to a prominence which he will perhaps not enjoy again hereafter.
He wasn't really isolated. He was isolated in that room, but he had huge backing from the Black community. The one article really makes fun of him. It talks about the color of his complexion, and he's sitting in the corner looking sad and bewildered. And no, he wasn't. That's ridiculous.
The insulting article did get one thing correct. Keeble would only serve a single term. He introduced bills to allow non-propertied men to hold office, to strengthen the legal rights of farm workers, and to provide funding for the Tennessee Manual Labor University. None of them made it to the House floor for a vote, but Sampson Keeble had opened a door that just a few years before had been impenetrable.
Keeble's election really put a little fear in the heart of Tennesseans, because I don't think they had really counted on the organizational skills of African Americans, being able to get people out to the polls to vote. And I think they were looking for a way to circumvent that. By today's standards, maybe he would not have been considered successful, but he was the trailblazer. And actually, I would say that his other colleagues who joined the Tennessee General Assembly later in the 1880s, they were torch bearers.
In 1874, the light of those torch bearers was 7 years away. And despite efforts at the federal level, the curtain of oppression was quickly closing across the South, as evidenced by a particular section of the Tennessee Code passed the following year.
During that dry spell, Chapter 130 is passed, which said basically that owners of businesses and their employees can refuse admittance to trains, boats, parks, circuses, museums, anything, any public space, as though it were their own home. The original bill talks about someone with kinky hair.
Be it enacted by the General Assembly of the State of Tennessee that it shall be lawful for the keeper of any public inn to exclude any person whose hair has a spiral curvature not greater than 1/4 of 1 inch radius, without regard to race, color, or previous condition of servitude.
Someone who's a descendant of cannibals.
Any person whose ancestors were cannibals or were guilty of the practice of voodooism, without regard to race, color, or previous condition of servitude.
And the Judiciary Committee that it went to said, well, we can't exactly use all this wording, but let's use this little bit, we'll rewrite it for you. And so it's very innocuous, but if you know the original bill, it's not. But they knew that the feds would be watching if they put a law like that into place that was so purely discriminatory that it wouldn't have a chance.
The feds were watching. The party of Lincoln still ruled in Washington, and it didn't like what it saw. As a result, Congress had passed new legislation just a few days before Tennessee answered with Chapter 130. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 protected rights to public accommodations and transportation regardless of color. But enforcement of the act was half-hearted at best, unlike Tennessee's first black code.
Chapter 130 is basically really going against what happened on the federal level. It becomes Tennessee's, what I consider the first Jim Crow law, and as black legislators come in the 80s, they spend a lot of their time trying to undo what the Tennessee General Assembly did.
During the 1880s, 12 African Americans served in the Tennessee General Assembly. 9 hailed from Southwest Tennessee, home to Memphis and a number of cotton plantation-rich counties along the fertile Mississippi Delta. 2 came from Chattanooga, and 1 from Keeble's home of Nashville. All areas of the state with large black populations. They were lawyers and laborers, soldiers and school teachers, ministers and magistrates. But for 400,000 black Tennesseans, they were much more.
The whole political scene has changed. And for African Americans in Tennessee, socially, politically, economically, it's a pretty, bad time. And it's a miracle in a way that you have that many black legislators elected to the General Assembly during the 1880s. And you can trace that out to the national elections. Each time there is a great Republican victory on the national level, similarly, the Republicans in Tennessee win, or the vote is very heavy. So I see Keeble and these other legislators not as aberrations or as accidents, but there are some connections to what's going on in state politics and also in national politics. They were the black elite class, and they, more than anybody, resented how blacks were treated because they had a little wealth, they had businesses, they had jobs, they could read and write, so on. And they were being treated badly, pushed aside and so on, under the threat of lynching at night. They didn't know when night riders were going to invade their homes. Their women could be mistreated and raped at any time, as they had done in slavery. And so when they got to the General Assembly, of course, their concerns would be those concerns about the treatment of African Americans who are now supposed to be citizens, according to the 14th Amendment.
Thomas Sykes wasted little time in attempting to retake ground lost to Chapter 130. When his bill to repeal the Jim Crow statute failed, Sykes joined forces with other black legislators in submitting a formal protest to the Speaker. The scathing report condemned the discriminatory law as a violation of the spirit, genius, and letter of our system of free government. Their complaint was largely ignored. The same fate befell Thomas Castle's anti-miscegenation bill, which sought to help end the sexual abuse of black women. In his second term, John Boyd's resolution prohibiting discrimination during rail travel was rewritten by white legislators to require racial segregation. Boyd himself voted against it, but House Bill 663 would become Tennessee's second Jim Crow law. Setback followed setback during the 43rd Assembly, but it is perhaps best remembered as the first term of one particular statesman.
I believe that the greatest one of them, the most articulate one of them, was from Haywood County, and that was Samuel McElwee.
McElwee was an interesting individual. I think he served 3 terms in the Tennessee General Assembly. He attended Fisk.
And he was a kid. He started as a college student. He was in law school by the time this happened. He was in his early 20s and powerful speaker. And I think they recognized that.
Sampson Keeble was Tennessee's first black legislator, but Samuel McElwee may well have been the most revered. Fellow statesmen, black and white, held the former Haywood County slave in such high regard that during his second term, he was nominated for Speaker of the House by former U.S. Senator Roderick Butler.
Mr. Speaker, it affords me much pleasure to nominate a candidate for Speaker, one that by his own strong arm and determined will, and being blessed with a splendid intellect, graduating a short time since at the Fisk University in this city with high honors, always vigilant and active, looking after the interests of his constituents and especially his race. I mean the Honorable S.A. McElwee of Haywood County. I am proud of this occasion. Having been born in the midst of slavery and a slaveholder myself, I am grateful to know that I state the feelings and sentiments of my party associates. S.A. McElwee is the peer of any member on this floor and will make an excellent speaker, and it affords me much pleasure to vote for him.
And he got all the Republican votes, which was 2-1. He lost because there were twice as many Democrats. But what an amazing thing to happen, and to have the support of all the people in the party to put him up there. They knew he couldn't win. Maybe that's why it was easier. But still, wow.
McElwee's nomination was one of the few high points for the black statesman during the 44th General Assembly. Former Fisk Jubilee singer Green Evans made another attempt to have Chapter 130 repealed, but Democrats refused to budge. During the 1880s, Tennessee's black statesmen authored 68 pieces of legislation, a handful of which became law. But with a deck stacked solidly against them, repeated attempts to repeal discriminatory black codes would prove futile. By 1886, lynchings had become relatively commonplace. During that summer, one particularly heinous murder would capture the public's attention. Eliza Woods was accused of poisoning the wife of her employer, a crime for which her employer would later confess. After being jailed in Jackson, Tennessee, a mob dragged her from her cell, stripped her, and in front of 1,000 people, hanged her on the courthouse square before shooting her repeatedly. A few months later, perhaps sensing this would be his last chance, Samuel McElwee pleaded with his fellow statesmen in a final, desperate attempt to stem the tide of violence and oppression.
My ear is pained. My soul is sick with every day's report of wrong and outrage perpetrated upon the Negroes by mob violence. I stand here today, Mr. Speaker, and enter my most solemn protest against mob violence in Tennessee. Great God, when will this nation treat the Negro as an American citizen? As a humble representative of the Negro race and as a member of this body, I stand here today and wave the flag of truce between the races and demand a reformation in Southern society by the passage of this bill.
Many House members agreed with McElwee. His impassioned words had struck a nerve, but the bill was eventually defeated by 5 votes. Not willing to take any chances on a 4th term for McElwee, white separatists in Haywood County targeted the Statesmen in November 1888. Facing an armed mob, he and his family were forced to flee, barely escaping to Nashville with their lives. Like several former legislators and thousands of freedmen, McElwee eventually left Tennessee.
When they go out at the end of the '89 session, there are no blacks left in the legislature. When they go out at the end of that time, the next legislature puts in a poll tax.
A sharecropper is making almost nothing. The poll tax could be up to $2, for you to vote. It would take you weeks of your pay to vote, and sharecroppers didn't see any money until the end of the year, and many of them saw no money at all because they owed the landowner all these things that sustained them up until the crop was sold. So it was a very precarious time for African Americans. Tennessee is neo-Confederate by the 1890s, and blacks don't have a prayer.
Prayers seemed to be answered, albeit briefly, in 1896, as Jesse Graham, the last black state representative of the century, was elected.
This was surprisingly late, well after we're into the Jim Crow era. He had worked in Louisville as a postal clerk, and that was the dispute in the House, that somebody said, oh, well, he's been up here working in Louisville all this time, and he has to have 3 years residence in Clarksville to be elected. Well, he'd lived there many more years than 3. He taught school there and all kinds of other things. I'm sure they wouldn't have made a deal out of that if it was somebody they wanted to keep.
The legislature had no intention of keeping Graham. After a resolution was passed claiming his seat vacant and a second election, a white Democrat took his place. The Jim Crow era became further entrenched with the passage of several laws aimed at disfranchising black voters in Tennessee. The Dortch Law denied African Americans assistance with marking their ballots, effectively barring illiterate blacks from the democratic process.
And there are even moments where they say there will be no other black legislators in Tennessee. That's documented. They could lose the votes. They could lie about the votes. In the election, it would have been the 4th term for McElwee. The poll people, the poll workers said, oh, well, we just made up numbers. This person lost, this person won, we just decided. And they completely admitted it. Nobody ever punished them for it. There was no consequence.
Literacy tests, poll taxes, and threats of violence kept many black voters away from the polls for decades. From the time Samuel McElwee was driven from Haywood County in 1888, more than 75 years would pass before another African American would serve in Tennessee's General Assembly.
It's an interesting story about McElwee in the 20th century. There was a Tennessee Historical Commission marker placed in Haywood County commemorating McElwee's service as a Tennessee legislator. But we got a call one day that we needed to move it because they didn't want a remembrance, if you will, of his contributions. And so today that marker sits on the campus of Fisk University. Because of his affiliation with Fisk, it had to be taken out of Haywood County. And this is in the late 20th century. So, there were still some of those strands of resistance to African Americans serving in a position of authority.
African Americans have been consistently fighting for the same thing. It's no different than today. That's what civil rights was about. It wasn't about sitting at a lunch counter, riding on a train. It was about enjoying equal participation in American economic and social life.
More than a century after Jesse Graham was denied his seat in the General Assembly, Tennessee's Legislative Black Caucus felt the need to acknowledge the contributions of their predecessors. The task of rediscovering their stories became a labor of love for Kathy Lauder. Years of painstaking research resulted in the creation of a comprehensive website detailing the lives of the legislators.
Most of this research hadn't been done yet. We've discovered things about these people that we had no idea we were going to find. And so then they decided, having had the website up for a while, that we should have a bust of Keeble. And it means a lot to people. While we were setting it up, one of the custodians came over that was working there. And she said, "What is this? Who is this?" And I said, "This is the man who was the first black legislator." And she cried. And she said, "Can I bring my children in to see this?" And so it turns out that a whole lot of Capitol staff came back with their kids to show them. It was a kind of an awakening of pride that people hadn't known about. Nobody knew about these legislators. They were a big surprise.
Their participation in the 1870s and 80s helps us to dispel the notion that they should not be included, that they are inferior and so on. So they set a precedent that African Americans could serve and serve well in the General Assembly.
We need to know on whose shoulders we are standing. When you look at those 14 individuals who served from the 1870s to the 1880s, they really are a phenomenal group of individuals. Sometimes I often wonder how much better off would the state of Tennessee be had some of the laws that the African American legislators wanted to put forth that would not have only helped African Americans, but would have helped the whole populace of the state of Tennessee. How much better off would the state of Tennessee be today?
The Citizenship Project is brought to you in part by a grant from Tennessee Civil War National Heritage Area.